I've always loved comic books. I own thousands at this point and have been collecting since I was a small child. Batman, Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, Spawn, and of course the topic for today's video, the X-Men. I've been following all of these since before it was cool. I remember people being bullied, called nerds just for reading, let alone reading the adventures of a spandex-clad superhero team. The X-Men is a franchise that has been part of my life for as long as I can remember. I own hundreds of X-Men comics and watched all the cartoons and the movies growing up. But in the last decade, nearly 2 now, something changed. Comic book movies, and so their characters, became mainstream popular. The normies got a hold of these characters and comic book movies were the big thing in culture, much like westerns and science fiction once were. Suddenly, everyone and their mother was always a fan of these characters. Everyone was suddenly an expert, claiming to know everything about everything, but their knowledge was very clearly limited to what they could find on Wikipedia. You'd think that with the movies and cartoons being so popular, that would be a good thing for the comics industry, right? Well, so would I. But that's not what happened. Marvel in particular failed to capitalize on the success of their Marvel Cinematic Universe, or MCU, and have continued to lose comic sales since the mid-2000s. Sure, there have been some high points here and there, but they have been on a downward trend ever since these problems began. But let's go back to the beginning. The X-Men comic books were originally not great sellers. They've even been cancelled once or twice, and had little or nothing to do with politics. Instead, they were a very generic superhero team that eventually turned into an epic science fiction space opera. Despite what people will try to tell you, no, the X-Men weren't based off of Malcolm X Little and Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech actually happened the same week the first X-Men issue was ever published. The speech taking place on August 28th, 1963, with the comic being published only a few days later at the beginning of September that same year. And everyone knows it takes more than a single weekend to conceptualize, write, draw, color, and letter a comic book, let alone actually getting it published and put into stores. The characters were actually based off of 2 Jewish leaders whom both Stan Lee and Jack Kirby had idolized, David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin. David Ben-Gurion being the first ever Prime Minister of Israel, who formally proclaimed the establishment of Israel and was the first to sign the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which he had helped write, and Menachem Begin being the 6th Prime Minister of Israel, who before the creation of the State of Israel was the leader of the Zionist militant group Irgun, the revisionist breakaway from the larger Jewish paramilitary organization Haganah. He famously proclaimed a revolt on the 1st of February 1944 against the British mandatory government, which was opposed by the Jewish Agency. But obviously none of that was prominent in the stories themselves, as Stan Lee said, for real-world social issues.
I've always tried to do our stories so that it didn't matter if you were of the white race, the black race, the brown race, or whatever. So social issues I try to get in the background or underlaying a plot, but never to the point of letting it interfere with the story or hitting the reader over the head.
Which is a lesson that more modern-day writers of comics are unfortunately yet to learn. For almost the first 3 decades of their history, the X-Men were a pretty basic superhero team. The idea of mutants was, as Stan Lee put it, simply an easy way to explain how all of these characters who had nothing to do with each other all gained superpowers separately. It wasn't originally a metaphor for any racial or religious inequities.
Where did X-Men come from in the first place? For those 5 or 6 of you who may not know the story here.
Well, let's see. I don't know whether to tell you the truth or make it an interesting story. I'll compromise. I had already done the Fantastic Four, and I had done Spider-Man, and I had done the Hulk. And I was looking for something else to do, and I thought the Fantastic Four was kind of successful, so I would do another group. But as you probably know, the toughest thing is to figure out where does a superhero get his or her power from. I mean, how many people can be bitten by radioactive spiders or zonked by gamma rays or cosmic rays? And I don't know that much about rays. I had run out of rays. So I was really stymied, and then inspiration hit. I realized I'm going to take the cowardly way out. If I say that my heroes are mutants, and they were just born that way, I don't have to explain anything. I don't have to use radioactivity. They're born that way. That's it. Take it or leave it.
It was December of 1969, half a decade after the ongoing series had been cancelled in 1966, when issue 63 would be the last new X story that the X-Men would feature in. The books would continue, but would only feature previously published tales, and would only be released 6 times a year, instead of 12. This lasted for another 5 years until May of 1975, when Marvel's all-new, all-different X-Men was released in the now classic, giant-sized X-Men issue 1. This is where Colossus would be introduced, and Wolverine would be added to the team, who had appeared in a single issue of The Incredible Hulk, issue 180 to be precise. 2 months later, the X-Men reprint stories would be canned, and Marvel would focus on these all-new, all-different mutant tales of suspense, with X-Men issue 94. Which is also when the X-Men finally start to take shape into the characters we all know and love today. With X-Men issue 94, soon to be renamed Uncanny X-Men, comic book legend Chris Claremont began his run writing stories for the now much beloved mutants. This would last for 17 years and would introduce many of the most classic stories like the Dark Phoenix saga and Days of Future Past, as well as the standalone graphic novel God Loves, Man Kills. It is within the last of those named that the foundation for the X-Men's MLK v Malcolm X vibe that fans have incorrectly credited to Stan Lee was laid. Despite what Stan Lee would later say about the character he co-created with Jack Kirby back in 1963, in the stories he wrote that used Magneto, the character wasn't striking back at prejudiced bigots or fighting in the defense of mutant kind. Magneto, as Stan Lee wrote him, was a true comic book bad guy who thought of mutants as superior and that they should rule over all of the, as he put it, genetically inferior humans. He was simply a villain in the traditional sense of good versus evil. It was Chris Claremont who gave Magneto an extreme makeover in the early 1980s that remade him into the sympathetic villain with a semi-noble mission, but was still very much a terrorist when it came to his methods of how he would go about his dream of taking over the world. It is Claremont that reimagined Magneto as a survivor of the Holocaust. It was also Claremont who rooted Xavier's dream of humans and mutants coexisting in the more iconic dream of Martin Luther King. Claremont describes how his X-Men were heavily influenced by the famous Martin Luther King quote that states, "I dream of a world where my children and their grandchildren will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." The polar opposite of what the dogmatic woke cult tries to do today. Instead, they try to push racist narratives into everything, saying people of a certain skin color are evil based on nothing but said skin color, and that anyone darker than pale is somehow a victim and therefore needs to be treated as such. It's here in the 80s, nearly 3 decades after the X-Men's inception, that they finally start to show signs of being analogous for civil rights. Certainly not at their beginning, and certainly not woke. Now is probably a good time to explain the difference between progressive and woke. Progressive is a good thing that most, if not all people can agree is a better thing for us to be. Everyone wants to be accepting of other cultures and be welcoming to people of all backgrounds and creeds. Progressive ideas can lead to peace among people of all colors, where wokeness is something very different. Woke is more of a mind virus, demonizing anyone of any color that disagrees with their radical ideas, putting blame on white people as a whole for anything bad that has ever happened to people of other races or sexualities. The woke ideology is only designed to destroy, to corrupt, and to demonize those who oppose it, glorifying anyone who is marginalized in any way, and to demoralize those same marginalized people into thinking the world is against them. Progressive and woke are not the same thing, and if anything, the success of Claremont's X-Men is proof of that. Progressive X-Men were at the peak of their popularity, where woke X-Men that you get in the comics today are a sad failure, losing more and more customers every day. It is progressive ideas that tell you you can be anything regardless of your background, and it is woke ideas that tell you that you can't. Paraphrasing J.R.R. Tolkien, evil cannot create anything new. They can only corrupt and ruin what good forces have invented or made. Though ideological underpinnings of Malcolm X would simmer just below the surface of X-Men comics throughout the 90s, it was Bryan Singer, the director of the first live-action X-Men movie released in July of 2000, who turned the knob of the allegory all the way up to 11. By inserting quotes from Malcolm X's famed "by any means necessary" speech, delivered at Harley's Audubon Ballroom in 1964.
The war is still coming, Charles, and I intend to fight it. By any means necessary.
Instead of trying to make the movies more like the comic books, Marvel tried to make the books more like the movies. Movies that were made by people who admittedly didn't actually like the source material. Everyone remembers the famous joke from the original X-Men movie directed by Bryan Singer.
You actually go outside in these things? What would you prefer? yellow spandex.
Yes, that's exactly what we would prefer, Brian. I remember watching the making of that movie where they were all laughing and saying the original costumes were silly, and yet these people, the ones who clearly weren't fans of the source material, were the people who were in charge of the direction of these movies. And in doing so, in charge of the direction that the public's perception of the characters would take. The X-Men were always much more than just an allegory for racism, and much more than representative of marginalized people. The X-Men was an epic science fiction space opera, utilizing things like time travel, magic, space travel, aliens, and other dimensions to tell grand fantastical stories. Yet there has never been any mention of Asteroid M, Krakoa, the Shi'ar, or their queen Lilandra, who becomes Xavier's wife. No time travel involving his son. Just the same old socio-political drama that was nothing more than a small footnote in the vast history of the X-Men. And it was this small footnote being used in the movies that brought the activists into the actual comic book industry. No earlier than 2012 had any of this been the main point of the X-Men. Slowly but surely, the books were almost entirely changed into what they are today. No longer were the X-Men allegorical or metaphorical for real-world issues, and instead were now straight up about these issues.
Social issues I try to get in the background or underlaying a plot.
And others that were not the original intent at all.
Sir, where did you get the idea for the X-Men, and did you originally create them to destroy racial prejudice?
I didn't create them to destroy racial prejudice.
Many new writers took this opportunity to turn the X-Men into their dreams of gay teen rom-coms, poorly thought-out romantic comedies, race-bashing, and on the extreme end, literal fetish books. Writers like Brian Michael Bendis turned Iceman gay in the very disturbing scene where Jean Grey, using her powers, convinces him that he is. Jerry Duggan, who wrote Fall of the House of X with Kieran Gillen, ended the heated love triangle between Scott, Logan, and Jean, with them all together in a happy polyamorous relationship. And Chuck Austin's fetishism of teenage girls in the Uncanny X-Men run, specifically dedicating entire pages to shaming Stacy X for her boobs. There are many other examples, these are just a few, but none have done more damage to the IP than one Jordan White. Jordan has overseen the X-Men as chief editor for the entire line of X-books since 2018. He is the man that gave the okay to a lot of the worst and cringiest things to come out of Marvel in the last few years. His ideas of an event book is marrying off two characters, then again, and again. Something that other than the wedding of Scott and Jean, or Gambit and Rogue, isn't something the fans had ever asked for. He is responsible for the X-Men becoming mutant supremacists, the very thing that they originally fought against, effectively making them act as villains, even recruiting some of the villains they once fought against, and for the internet meme that is Nightcrawler's retconned parentage. He turned every character Marvel would allow into stereotypes of gay people borderlining parody, and he is the man who finally pushed X-Men beyond progressive and into the category of woke. Under his leadership, the X-Men went from a middle-tier book, which was already a fall from grace as they used to be a top-tier bestseller, to the literal bottom of the barrel in sales. I guess all of this is just to say, no, the X-Men weren't always woke, you're just stupid.
He said it! He said it!
But that's all I have for you today. My name's Dean James, your mate in comics from the land down under. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys again next time.